A 16-year-old boy walking home from a party, stopped by police, accused of stealing a backpack. He says he didn't do it. The alleged victim can't identify him. But Kalief Browder would spend the next 3 years at Rikers Island without ever being convicted of crime. 2 of those years in solitary confinement. This is the story of how America's most notorious jail became a death sentence for a teenager who refused to plead guilty to something he didn't do. How the system broke him. How he tried to survive. And why, even after he got out, Rikers Island wouldn't let him go. According to the Vera Institute of Justice, in 2010, the average stay at Rikers for adolescents awaiting trial was 158 days. Kalief Browder waited 1,111 days. What you're about to see explains why New York City would eventually vote to close Rikers Island entirely. But the real twist? It's what happened after Kalief finally got released. Something that would shock even the investigators who thought they'd seen everything. Rikers Island. 400 acres in the East River between Queens and the Bronx. 10 jails on one island. Capacity, 15,000 inmates. But here's what makes Rikers different from almost every other detention facility in America. Most people held here haven't been convicted of anything. They're waiting. Waiting for lawyers. Waiting for court dates. Waiting for a system that's completely broken. In 2010, when Kalief Browder arrived, Rikers was experiencing a crisis. According to Department of Correction data, violence was spiking. Use of force incidents had increased by 29% in just 2 years. Former inmates describe an environment where correction officers and gang members operated with near impunity. The Robert N. Davern Center, RNDC, where Kalief would be held, was designated for adolescents and young adults ages 16 to 18. But according to multiple investigations, it had become one of the most violent facilities on the island. Human Rights Watch documented a disturbing pattern. Adolescents at Rikers were being subjected to what investigators called a culture of violence. Between 2012 and 2013 alone, there were more than 1,000 documented cases of inmates being injured by staff. But the real danger wasn't just the beatings you could see coming. It was solitary confinement. Inmates called it the box or the bing, a cell measuring roughly 6 by 8 feet. 23 hours a day alone, sometimes for weeks, sometimes for months. For adolescents, according to psychiatric experts, the psychological damage can be catastrophic. Dr. Homer Venters, former chief medical officer for NYC jails, testified in multiple cases that solitary confinement of adolescents resulted in documented cases of self-harm, suicide attempts, and severe psychological deterioration. In 2012, the same year Kalief Browder spent months in solitary, there were 129 documented self-harm incidents among adolescent inmates at Rikers. But here's what makes Rikers uniquely dangerous. It's a jail, not a prison. The distinction matters. Prisons hold people who've been convicted and sentenced. Jails hold people awaiting trial. People who are legally still innocent. And at Rikers, that wait could destroy you. According to the New York City Independent Budget Office, the average time from arraignment to disposition for felony cases in 2010 was 827 days. Nearly 2.5 years. For adolescents who couldn't make bail, that meant 2.5 years in one of America's most violent detention facilities. The answer comes down to one thing: money. In Kalief Browder's case, bail was set at $3,000. His family couldn't afford it. According to the Bronx Defenders, in 2010, 87% of adolescents held at Rikers were there because they couldn't pay bail amounts of $2,500 or less. You're accused of a crime. You haven't been found guilty, but you can't pay. So you wait. And while you wait, your life falls apart. Former public defenders describe a system designed to pressure defendants into plea deals. Court dates get postponed. Evidence gets delayed. Months turn into years. And the prosecutor knows that every day you spend on Rikers makes you more likely to plead guilty, even if you didn't do it, just to get out. In Kalief Browder's case, his trial would be postponed more than 30 times. 30 times. Each time, he had to make a choice. Plead guilty to something he insisted he didn't do, or stay on Rikers and wait. According to court transcripts, prosecutors offered Kalief multiple plea deals. Plead guilty, get time served, walk out that day. But there was a catch. A guilty plea would give him a criminal record. It would affect his ability to get jobs, housing, student loans. It would define the rest of his life. Kalief refused. Over and over, for 3 years, he said the same thing. I didn't do it. Most people broke. According to the Innocence Project, an estimated 10 to 15% of people who plead guilty to crimes are actually innocent. The pressure to take a deal, any deal, is overwhelming. But Kalief Browder wouldn't break. And that decision would nearly kill him. Former inmates from RNDC describe what happens when you don't play along. When you insist on your innocence. When you demand a trial. The system makes you an example. According to testimony from multiple former Rikers detainees, correction officers viewed inmates who refused plea deals as troublemakers. Court documents show that Kalief was involved in at least 28 documented altercations with officers and other inmates during his time at Rikers. But here's what the official reports don't tell you. Don't say. In 2012, surveillance footage from inside RNDC began to leak. What it showed contradicted years of official incident reports. Videos documented officers beating adolescent inmates. Multiple officers attacking single inmates. Officers standing by while inmates assaulted each other. The Bronx Defenders and other advocacy groups filed dozens of complaints. But according to former legal aid attorneys, in most cases, officers faced no significant consequences. One video, obtained by The New Yorker, would later show correction officers beating Kalief Browder while he was defenseless. The same officers wrote in their report that Kalief had attacked them. The footage proved that was a lie. This is what made Rikers Island terrifying. Not just the violence, but the knowledge that when violence happened, no one would be held accountable. Former inmates consistently describe a feeling of helplessness. You could follow every rule, keep your head down, do everything right, and still, something could happen to you. And if you complained? According to investigative reports from the U.S. Attorney's Office, retaliation was common. Inmates who filed grievances often found themselves targeted, moved to more dangerous units, placed in solitary, denied access to programs or medical care. The message was clear: suffer in silence or suffer worse. So how do you survive a place like that? How do you make it through 1,000 days in hell when you're still legally innocent? If you want to understand how broken the system really is, make sure you're subscribed, because what happens next will show you why this case changed everything. There are rules, unwritten rules, and breaking them could be the last mistake you ever make. Former inmates from Rikers describe 3 rules that govern life inside. These aren't official regulations. They're the code, the survival manual, the thing that determines whether you make it out or you don't. Rule number 1, never show weakness. In testimony given to investigators, a former RNDC inmate described his first day. They're watching you from the moment you walk in, how you carry yourself, how you respond when someone tests you. If they see fear, you're done. According to multiple documented accounts, new arrivals at Rikers, especially adolescents, were routinely tested by other inmates and sometimes by officers. These tests could be verbal challenges, demands for commissary items, or outright physical confrontations. The goal was simple: establish dominance or become a target. The testing phase. In another case documented by legal aid attorneys, a 17-year-old we'll call Marcus described his first week at RNDC in 2011. Court testimony indicates that within hours of arriving, older inmates demanded his phone privileges and commissary access. When he refused, 3 inmates assaulted him in a day room while correction officers, according to his testimony, stood there and watched. Marcus had failed the test. Former inmates describe a hierarchy that formed quickly. At the top, older gang-affiliated inmates who controlled access to resources and protection. At the bottom, anyone perceived as weak. And in Rikers adolescent facilities, according to investigative reports, correction officers often allowed this hierarchy to exist because it made the jail easier to control. Kalief's response. According to later interviews, Kalief Browder understood this dynamic immediately. Court records show that during his first months at RNDC, he was involved in multiple altercations. But former inmates who knew him described someone who refused to back down. In a 2014 interview with The New Yorker, Kalief explained, "I wasn't going to let anyone think they could take advantage of me. But that stance came with a price." Rule number 2. Keep your mouth shut. The second rule was absolute. Don't snitch. Don't cooperate with investigations. Don't file grievances. And definitely don't testify against other inmates or correction officers. According to U.S. Attorney's Office investigations, inmates who violated this rule faced severe retaliation. One documented case from 2012 involved a 16-year-old who reported being beaten by correction officers. Within days, according to legal filings, he was moved to a unit controlled by gang members hostile to him. 2 weeks later, he was stabbed. The attack was investigated. No charges were filed. The culture of silence. This culture of silence served everyone in power. Correction officers could use excessive force without fear of consequences. Gang leaders could operate internal economies, trafficking contraband. Administrators could report artificially low incident numbers. And inmates? They suffered quietly or faced worse. According to testimony from former inmates, even medical emergencies were underreported. In multiple documented cases, inmates with serious injuries delayed seeking treatment for days because they knew they'd be questioned about what happened. And telling the truth could get you killed. This is what landed Kalief Browder in solitary confinement. Multiple times. According to Department of Correction records, he spent approximately 800 days in solitary. Nearly 2 years. Much of it in punitive segregation for fighting. But here's what those records don't specify. According to Kalief's later testimony and interviews, many of those fights were defensive. He was being targeted. And when he defended himself, he was the one punished. The system created an impossible situation. Refuse to be victimized, and you'd be locked in solitary. Accept victimization, and you become a permanent target. Kalief chose solitary. Rule number 3. Trust no one. The third rule governed every interaction. Trust no one. Not other inmates. Not correction officers. Not even your lawyer. At least not until they prove themselves. According to public defenders who worked at Rikers during this period, the level of paranoia was justified. Confidential information leaked. Deals got broken. Promises meant nothing. The informant system. Investigative reports revealed that correction officers routinely used inmate informants to gather intelligence. In exchange for information about other inmates, informants received privileges, extra commissary, better housing assignments, protection from gang violence. But according to former inmates, this system made everyone suspicious of everyone. You couldn't have a private conversation. You couldn't express weakness. You couldn't form genuine alliances because anyone could be working with the officers. One former RNDC inmate described it in a 2013 deposition. It's psychological warfare. You're isolated even when you're surrounded by people. These 3 rules: never show weakness, keep your mouth shut, trust no one, created an environment of constant stress. Former inmates describe never being able to relax. Sleep deprivation was common. According to mental health evaluations conducted on former Rikers detainees, symptoms of PTSD, anxiety, and depression were documented in more than 60% of adolescent inmates. But the real damage was invisible. It was what happened inside your mind when you spent years in that environment. And for Kalief Browder, who was fighting to maintain his innocence while enduring this psychological torture, the breaking point was coming. But first, you need to understand what was happening behind the scenes. The system most people never see. While Kalief Browder was fighting for survival at Rikers, another battle was being waged in courtrooms and administrative offices across New York City. A battle over paperwork, evidence, court dates, the machinery of justice that was supposed to protect him. According to legal experts, this is where the system actually breaks down. Not in the violence on Rikers, but in the bureaucratic nightmare that keeps people trapped there. In Kalief's case, one of the key pieces of evidence was supposed to be a surveillance video from the night of the alleged robbery. According to court transcripts, The prosecution claimed this video existed, but they couldn't produce it. Month after month, court date after court date, Kalief's public defender requested the video. The prosecution said they were working on it. The judge granted more time. Then more time. Then more time. According to former New York legal aid attorneys, this delay tactic was common. Prosecutors would claim evidence existed to support bail and detention, but then drag out the discovery process. The longer an innocent defendant stayed at Rikers, the more likely they were to accept a plea deal. The witness problem. Then there was the alleged victim, the person who claimed Kalief stole his backpack. According to court documents, this witness failed to appear at multiple scheduled court dates. In fact, testimony indicates the witness returned to Mexico and became increasingly difficult to locate. A reasonable person might ask, if your only witness disappears and you can't produce your key evidence, shouldn't the case be dismissed? The dismissal that never came. According to legal analysts who reviewed the case, there were multiple opportunities where the charges against Kalief should have been dropped. The missing evidence, the absent witness, the lack of physical proof. But the case continued. Former prosecutors explained that dismissing cases, especially cases that have already resulted in long detentions, creates a different problem. It raises questions about why someone was held so long in the first place. It opens the door to lawsuits. It makes the system look incompetent or malicious. So the case dragged on, and Kalief stayed at Rikers. The public defender crisis. But there's another factor most people don't understand. According to New York State data, in 2010, the average public defender in the Bronx was handling approximately 400 cases per year. The American Bar Association recommends a maximum caseload of 150 felonies per attorney per year. Do the math. That's less than 4 hours per case per year, including court time. Kalief's representation. Kalief Browder cycled through multiple public defenders during his 3 years at Rikers. According to court records, his lawyers changed at least 4 times due to reassignments and office turnover. Each new attorney had to familiarize themselves with the case. Each transition caused more delays. Former public defenders describe an impossible situation. You care about your clients, but you're drowning in cases. You can't give anyone the attention they deserve. You're triaging constantly, focusing on the most serious charges, the most immediate crises. And for someone like Kalief, who refused to plead guilty, that meant his case kept getting pushed to the bottom of the priority list. The systemic design. Here's what you need to understand. This wasn't a malfunction. According to criminal justice reform advocates who studied the system, this was the design. The overwhelming caseloads, the delayed discovery, the missing witnesses, the endless postponements, all of it served one purpose: to pressure defendants into plea deals. According to Department of Justice statistics, approximately 95% of criminal cases nationwide are resolved through plea bargains, not trials. The system can't function any other way. If even 10% of defendants demanded trials, the courts would collapse. So the system is designed to make going to trial so painful, so expensive, so psychologically destructive that almost no one does it. The cost calculation. For Kalief Browder, the calculation was brutal. According to prosecutors' plea offers documented in court records, if he pled guilty, he'd get time served plus probation. He'd walk out of Rikers that day. If he insisted on a trial and lost, he could face 7 years in prison. But pleading guilty meant admitting to a crime he insisted he didn't commit. It meant a felony record. It meant giving up his belief in his own innocence. The psychological warfare. Former inmates and legal advocates describe this as a form of torture. Not physical, though that was present at Rikers, but psychological. The uncertainty, the waiting. The knowledge that you could end this suffering at any moment by just saying the words, "I'm guilty." According to psychiatric evaluations conducted on former Rikers detainees, the psychological impact of prolonged pretrial detention includes documented cases of depression, anxiety, PTSD, and suicidal ideation. The rate of mental health crises among pretrial detainees is significantly higher than among sentenced prisoners. The hidden cost. But here's the part that shocked even experienced criminal justice reformers when they started examining Kalief's case in detail: the financial cost. According to the New York City Independent Budget Office, it cost approximately $460 per day to house an inmate at Rikers in 2012. Kalief was there for 1,111 days. New York City spent over $500,000 keeping a teenager in jail for allegedly stealing a backpack worth $700. A teenager who was never convicted. A teenager who had no prior criminal record. And that doesn't include court costs, public defender fees, or the eventual settlement with Kalief's family. The system wasn't just cruel. It was insane. Transition. But the real cost, the cost that no amount of money could calculate, was what these 3 years did to Kalief Browder himself. And to understand that, you need to hear what actually happened to him inside Rikers. The documented incidents, the violence, the breaking point, arrival. May 15th, 2010. According to court testimony, Kalief Browder was walking home from a party in the Bronx when police stopped him. An individual had reported a robbery 2 weeks earlier. Someone had stolen his backpack containing a camera, $700 cash, and a credit card. The alleged victim pointed at Kalief and his friend. The police arrested both of them. Kalief told police they had the wrong person. He'd been at a party. He hadn't stolen anything. But according to arrest records, he was charged with robbery, grand larceny, and assault. The arraignment. At his arraignment, according to court records, Kalief was assigned a public defender he'd never met. The meeting lasted minutes. Bail was set at $3,000. Actually $900 cash, since bail is typically paid at 10%. His family couldn't afford it. According to his mother's later testimony, they tried everything. They asked family members. They looked into bail bonds. But with no collateral and bad credit, no bondsman would help them. So Kalief was sent to Rikers to await trial. In early 2013, after nearly 3 years at Rikers, something finally changed. According to court records, the prosecution informed the court that their witness, the alleged victim, would not be returning to testify. They could not proceed with the case. On May 29, 2013, according to court transcripts, the charges against Kalief Browder were dismissed. All of them. The prosecution admitted they didn't have enough evidence to proceed. Kalief had spent 1,111 days at Rikers Island. 2 years of that in solitary confinement. He had endured violence, psychological torture, and multiple suicide attempts. He was released. He went home. But the story doesn't end there. And what happened next is what would shock even the most cynical observers of the criminal justice system. The aftermath. According to family testimony, Kalief tried to rebuild his life. He enrolled in community college. He got his GED. He became an advocate, speaking out about his experience at Rikers. Media outlets interviewed him. The New Yorker published a detailed investigation of his case. He seemed to be recovering, moving forward, fighting to make sure what happened to him wouldn't happen to others. But according to mental health experts who examined him after his release, the damage was already done. The invisible wounds. Dr. Kalief Browder, Kalief's brother, later testified about what life was like after Rikers. According to his account, Kalief suffered from severe PTSD. He had panic attacks, flashbacks. He couldn't sleep. He heard voices. He experienced paranoia and depression. He was prescribed medication. He went to therapy. But according to psychiatric experts, the trauma he experienced, especially the extended solitary confinement during adolescence, had caused lasting brain changes. The damage might be permanent. The final tragedy. On June 6, 2015, 2 years after his release, Kalief Browder hanged himself at his family's home in the Bronx. He was 22 years old. According to the medical examiner, his death was ruled a suicide. But to those who knew his story, to the advocates who'd been fighting for reform, to the experts who understood the psychological impact of what he'd endured, Kalief's death wasn't just a suicide. It was a homicide by the criminal justice system. Transition. But here's what most people still don't know about Kalief Browder's case. The real twist. The thing that would force New York City to confront what Rikers Island had become. The twist. In the weeks after Kalief's death, as media attention intensified, investigators began digging deeper into his case. What they found was explosive. According to court documents that were later unsealed, the surveillance video, the key piece of evidence the prosecution claimed existed but could never produce, never actually existed. There was no tape. There never had been. The prosecution had used the mere possibility of its existence to justify keeping Kalief detained for 3 years while they searched for it. They'd been lying the entire time. The cover-up. According to legal experts who reviewed the case files, this wasn't incompetence. It was strategy. By claiming evidence existed, prosecutors could justify opposing bail reduction. They could justify continuing the prosecution despite a missing witness. They could maintain pressure on Kalief to accept a plea deal. Former prosecutors who spoke anonymously to journalists admitted this was common practice. You claim evidence exists. You delay discovery. You hope the defendant breaks. Usually, they do. But Kalief didn't, and it killed him. The settlement. In 2016, according to public records, New York City settled with Kalief's family for $3.3 million. The settlement came with no admission of wrongdoing. No individual correction officers were disciplined. No prosecutors faced consequences. But the money wasn't the point. The attention was. Kalief's case became a rallying cry. Advocacy groups used his story to push for reforms. Celebrities took up the cause. Politicians who'd ignored Rikers for decades suddenly promised change. The reforms that followed. According to New York City Council records, several significant reforms were implemented in the years following Kalief's death. In 2015, New York raised the age of criminal responsibility, meaning 16 and 17-year-olds would no longer be automatically prosecuted as adults. Solitary confinement for adolescents under 18 was banned in city jails. Bail reform passed in 2019, eliminating cash bail for most misdemeanors and nonviolent felonies. And in 2019, New York City voted to close Rikers Island entirely. The target date for closure, 2027. The bigger picture. But here's what reformers want you to understand. Rikers Island isn't the exception. According to data from the Prison Policy Initiative across America, there are more than 460,000 people sitting in jail right now who haven't been convicted of any crime. They're awaiting trial. Most of them are there because they can't afford bail. The median bail amount for felony charges in the United States is $10,000. For someone living paycheck to paycheck, that might as well be $1 million. So they sit and they wait. And the pressure to plead guilty to anything just to get out becomes overwhelming. The continuing crisis. According to recent reports, despite the reforms, problems at Rikers continue. In 2022, according to the New York City Department of Correction, 16 people died in custody at Rikers, the highest number in decades. Staffing shortages have led to inmates being locked in their cells for 23 hours a day, not as punishment, but simply because there aren't enough officers to supervise them. The facility that was supposed to close in 2027 may stay open longer. And new jails being built to replace Rikers are facing criticism that they'll simply recreate the same problems in different buildings. Kalief's legacy. But something did change. According to advocates who worked on these issues for decades, Kalief Browder's case changed the conversation. It made the invisible visible. It forced people to confront what pretrial detention really means. Jay-Z produced a documentary series about Kalief's life. The New Yorker's investigation won awards. Politicians who'd ignored these issues for years suddenly made them campaign priorities. Kalief didn't live to see the reforms his case inspired. But according to his family, that was his intention. In his final months, he'd told them, "I want my story to mean something. I wanted to change things." The final truth. Here's the truth most people still don't want to face. Kalief Browder's story isn't unique. It's just the one that got attention. According to advocates who work in this system every day, there are thousands of people experiencing similar injustices right now. Held for years without trial. Stuck because they can't afford bail. Subjected to violence and psychological torture. Pressured to plead guilty to crimes they didn't commit. The system that broke Kalief is still operating. And until we fundamentally change how we approach pretrial detention, cash bail, and jail conditions, there will be more Kaliefs. The question is, will we pay attention to them before it's too late? The meaning. So what was Rikers Island, really? What made it so dangerous that a teenager who'd never been convicted of anything would rather die than return? It wasn't just the violence. It wasn't just the solitary confinement. It was the combination of all of it. The brutality, the indifference, the systemic failures, and perhaps most devastating, the knowledge that no one was coming to help you. Kalief Browder spent 1,111 days at Rikers Island fighting for his innocence. He won that fight. The charges were dismissed. But the victory cost him everything. The systemic failure. According to criminal justice reform experts, every institution failed Kalief. The police who arrested him based on a 2-week-old identification by a witness who couldn't actually describe him. The prosecution who pursued charges they knew they couldn't prove and lied about evidence they didn't have. The courts who postponed his case more than 30 times over 3 years instead of dismissing charges they knew were weak. The Department of Correction, which allowed, and in some cases participated in, violence against a teenage detainee who was legally innocent. The mental health system, which recognized his suicidal ideation but returned him to the conditions that caused it. Every single system designed to protect him failed. The human cost. But beyond the statistics and the policy debates, there's a human cost that can't be calculated. According to his family's testimony, Kalief was a good kid. He loved basketball. He was close with his siblings. He had dreams of going to college, starting a business. He had a future. Rikers Island took that from him. Not because he was dangerous. Not because he was guilty. But because he was poor and black and caught in a system that treats poverty like criminality. The ongoing fight. CTA 3. Kalief's story must be told. If you think this matters, subscribe now, because there are more stories like this that need to be exposed. And watch until the end for what you can do to help. Today, advocacy groups continue fighting for the reforms Kalief's case inspired. The movement to close Rikers. The campaign to end cash bail. The fight to ban solitary confinement nationwide. According to these organizations, progress is being made, but slow. And meanwhile, people are still suffering. If you want to help, here's what you can do. Support bail funds that help people who can't afford bail. Contact your local representatives about pretrial detention reform. Support organizations working to end cash bail and close dangerous jails. Share stories like Kalief's to keep pressure on the system. Because the only reason we know Kalief's story is because people refuse to let it be forgotten. The final message. Kalief Browder's mother, Vanita, passed away in 2016, a year after her son. Family members said the stress of losing Kalief contributed to her death. She spent her final year fighting for justice for her son, giving interviews, pushing for reforms. Before she died, she said something that advocates still quote, "My son held on to his innocence until it killed him. The system should be ashamed. We all should be ashamed." Watch next. Rikers Island is still operating. And while it's the most notorious jail in America, it's far from the only one where these abuses happen. The pretrial detention crisis affects hundreds of thousands of people across the United States. If you want to understand more about how the American criminal justice system fails the people it's supposed to protect, watch our documentary on the Louisiana State Penitentiary, where the average inmate serves a sentence longer than most murderers in Europe. Or check out our investigation into supermax prisons, where people spend decades in solitary confinement with no human contact. These aren't isolated stories. They're a pattern, and the more you understand the pattern, the harder it becomes to ignore. Final words. Kalief Browder was 16 years old when he was arrested for allegedly stealing a backpack. He was 22 when he took his own life. In between those two moments, he endured hell. He fought for his innocence. He survived violence, torture, and psychological warfare. He was proven right. The charges were dismissed. But he never really got out of Rikers Island. His story isn't over. Because every day, somewhere in America, another Kalief Browder is sitting in a jail cell, waiting for justice that may never come. The question is, are we paying attention?